A groundbreaking TV series decades ahead of its time that graduated to a series of feature films. After nearly 30 years of pop culture prominence, would its legacy be the adventures of a handful of characters created in the 1960s? Or could the franchise continue its mission with new characters and stories that no one thought they could tell? Hi, I'm Dan Larson, and this is the history of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Thank you to 80stees.com for sponsoring this video. Click the link in the description below and use code TOYGALAXY to get 30% off your order today. 80stees.com started off as the source for t-shirts inspired by all things pop culture from the 1980s, but there's more to the 80s than just the 80s. They've got shirts inspired by the 70s, the decade that paved the way for the 80s. They've got shirts inspired by the 90s, the decade that carried on the legacy of the 80s. They've got shirts inspired by the 2000s, because the 80s isn't just a decade, it's a state of mind. Whether your interests are laser focused on one thing, say movies, there's plenty of choices from Jaws to Shaun of the Dead. If your interests bounce around, they've got shirts from cartoons to video games, superheroes to music and wrestling. From Transformers to Dungeons & Dragons, Gollum to Ron Burgundy, Darkwing Duck to Powerpuff Girls, you'll find something you love. Click the link below and use code TOYGALAXY for 30% off your order today. Again, that's code TOYGALAXY for 30% off your order. Thanks again to 80stees.com. For this video, we are focusing on one small part of a very large franchise. This is not the story of Star Trek in total, just the bits that are relevant to this particular chapter, and the bridge between two eras. And in the interest of brevity, we are going to leave out a lot of stuff, on purpose. You've probably heard some anecdotes, seen some other behind-the-scenes videos that have interesting things in them that we won't get to include here. Feel free to leave those items in the comments down below so everyone else can enjoy.
Have you checked the back sections of newspapers and magazines lately? How many dramas have taken place in these tight little boxes?
Did you have a favorite book as a child?
Star Trek: The Next Generation is a 178-episode live-action syndicated television series that originally aired over 7 seasons in the US from September of 1987 to May of 1994. It is technically the 3rd Star Trek television series, but only the 2nd if you don't include Saturday morning cartoons. Hundreds of years from now, in the 24th century, the Earth is part of the United Federation of Planets. The Federation has a fleet of starships at its disposal, part military defense force, part scientific expeditionary fleet. These starships are led by the flagship vessel, the USS Enterprise. Captained by Jean-Luc Picard, who is supported by a team of brilliant tacticians and engineers, as well as an empath, a Klingon, and a synthetic life form hosting an artificial intelligence that strives to be more human. Together they journey across the stars, learning more about life, existence, and what's out there deep in space beyond imagination. Star Trek as a media franchise began in 1966 with the television series Star Trek, created by Gene Roddenberry, produced by Desilu Productions to begin, and Paramount Television in the end. It ran 79 episodes over 3 seasons through 1969 on the NBC network. It was a science fiction adventure series set in the 23rd century with stories focused on the crew of a spaceship called the Enterprise, whose 5-year mission was to explore the galaxy. The core of that crew was Captain James T. Kirk, First Officer Spock, Chief Medical Officer Bones McCoy, Chief Engineer Scotty, Communications Officer Uhura, Helmsman Sulu, and Navigator Chekhov. Conceptually, it was a show about trailblazing through space during a time of relative peace and prosperity for the people of Earth. Functionally, it was a show trailblazing through science fiction, pop culture, and social norms of the era. It was a series that set new television standards with the characters it depicted, the way they interacted with each other, and the genuine positivity it maintained with regard to a better, brighter future ahead for us all during a tumultuous time in American history. After 3 seasons, NBC canceled Star Trek, citing low ratings. A shot that was intended to kill the series ultimately made it stronger. In syndication, Star Trek found an even larger audience, reaching a wider range of demographics and becoming even more valuable to Paramount than it was when it was originally airing. By 1972, fan support for the series had developed into Star Trek conventions celebrating the series, its creators, and stars. From 1973 to 1974, Paramount partnered with Filmation position to capitalize on that continued fan enthusiasm, producing a 22-episode animated series that many would argue acted as the fourth season of the original series. The day Star Trek was canceled in 1969, series creator Gene Roddenberry started kicking around ideas for a feature film. Paramount wasn't really excited about it until the combined success of the original series reruns and 2 seasons of the animated series demonstrated the ongoing growth of the fan base. In 1975, a movie seemed like it was a real possible next step. That all changed in May of 1977 when Star Wars flipped over the game of science fiction movies, of action-adventure, of filmmaking, special effects, blockbusters, toy tie-ins, spaceships, heroes and villains, pet naming. Paramount flinched, thinking audiences wouldn't be interested in seeing 2 science fiction feature films like that in a single year. Who's got the patience for all the lasers, all the spaceships? Instead, they turned their eyes back to the small screen for a new series called Star Trek Phase 2. New designs for costumes, props, and a new bridge. They reached out to the original cast because you can't call it Star Trek, without the 6 main characters that are in Star Trek. Star Trek was so important as a brand that Paramount Pictures was going to use it to lure investors and viewers to a new broadcast network. Paramount TV was going to compete with the established Big Three, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Until it didn't receive enough financial backing and Paramount scrapped the whole plan altogether. So what? Star Trek was back on track to theaters because in November of 1977, Close Encounters of the Third Kind proved that audiences would indeed pay to see more than 1 science fiction movie per year. There was plenty of room in outer space for Luke Skywalker, Roy Neary, and Captain James T. Kirk. Star Trek the Motion Picture arrived in 1979, followed by Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan in 1982. As a franchise, Star Trek proved it was more than capable of standing up to Star Wars. As George Lucas and Fox released the final act of their trilogy, Return of the Jedi in 1983, Star Trek kept on rolling with their third act, Star Trek III The Search for Spock in 1984, and then Star Trek IV The Voyage Home in 1986. After 20 years as a centerpiece of American pop culture, Star Trek was making a lot of money for Paramount. At the same time, it was also beginning to cost a lot. Despite it still being the most popular syndicated television series, the balance sheet was trembling with each new cinematic chapter released. Each new Star Trek movie Paramount release meant that it was going to cost more to bring back integral characters James T. Kirk and Spock, the characters that were most associated with the brand. By 1986's Voyage Home, William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy's salaries were becoming unsustainable. The comparably low budget of television production was looking attractive again. The people who worked with Gene Roddenberry generally recognize him as a visionary when it comes to Star Trek. He had a clear concept of the future of mankind, and maintaining that through the original series was one of his primary goals. But as the years went by, as the movies were released, Roddenberry's role was minimized in the day-to-day production. He became essentially a consultant on the films, almost an honorary part of the production, with a title to recognize the contributions he had made and an office to keep him out of the way. On the verge of retirement, Paramount called him back to active duty by signaling that they were going to start production on a new Star Trek series. Roddenberry wasn't particularly interested in developing a new series, but there was absolutely no way he was going to let Paramount do it without him.
No way. Not this time. Not this time. No, not this time. No way. Not a chance.
Paramount owned Star Trek and could have proceeded without him, but having Roddenberry on board was essential to the project's success, especially in the eyes of the very dedicated fan base. Roddenberry's inclusion would theoretically bring a significant degree of goodwill before a single script was even written. After a highly contentious negotiation fueled by Roddenberry's resentment over the cancellation of the original series back in 1969, they came to an agreement for Roddenberry to begin development of the new series, supplemented by a very large sack of cash with his name on it. He immediately brought in a team of writers and producers that had worked on the original series and the animated series. That included the story editor and writer from the original series, Dorothy D.C. Fontana, writer Bob Justman, writer David Gerrold, and original series associate producer Eddie Milkus. The team of 5 began kicking around ideas, coming up with new concepts, new characters, and figuring out what a new series set nearly 100 years after the original series would look like. Meanwhile, Paramount was trying to sell the show to a network as cable wasn't yet a viable option. After failing to entice investors to build a new Paramount television network, they offered Star Trek as someone else's potential centerpiece for a new or existing network. Barry Diller was building the new Fox television network and wanted to use Star Trek in the process, but wouldn't commit to buying a full season, preferring to mitigate risk and cost with only 13 episodes instead of 26. Original Star Trek broadcast partner NBC said no, as did ABC. CBS was interested, but only for a miniseries. But from that despair came inspiration. Paramount's president of distribution, Lucy Salhaney, had the brilliant idea to avoid the networks altogether and embrace the thing that had really allowed Star Trek to become the pop culture juggernaut in the first place: syndication. In this case, first-run syndication meant that they could produce the show outside of any specific demands of any network and just sell the packages out to affiliates region by region. Stations would have the freedom to program as fit their schedules. It was an unprecedented approach to a series like Star Trek. It was a gamble. Rick Berman became the series' supervising producer, and by winter of 1986, DC Fontana was working on the script for the first episode about a mysterious alien outpost. Casting for the series began, as did the backlash to public announcements about the development of the new series. As far as fans were concerned, if it wasn't Captain Kirk, it wasn't Star Trek. It wasn't just the fans who were worried about changes being made to their favorite television series. Kirk himself, William Shatner, said in an interview with Starlog magazine, quote, "To call a series Star Trek that doesn't have the cast and the ship in it is an error. The error seems to me to be overexposure of the Star Trek name and the possibility of not having the Star Trek quality we've become accustomed to." That was the real challenge for a new Star Trek series. Whether it could transcend being a story about the handful of original crew members, was the Enterprise explicitly defined by the presence of Captain Kirk, Spock, and Bones?
A new series is coming to television, starting with a spectacular 2-hour world premiere movie, Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Premieres Wednesday, September 30th on Fox, WXIM 59.
Producer Rick Berman and creator Gene Roddenberry went in the exact opposite direction with the new captain of the Enterprise. Instead of the young, handsome, swashbuckling hero with a full head of hair, they went with a proper, rigid, formal, bald guy with an accent. A clear signal that this was going to be a new and different Star Trek, not a rehash or Star Trek Light. Patrick Stewart as Captain Jean-Luc Picard would have a first officer and Commander Will Riker, played by Jonathan Frakes, and the Spock of the series, an emotionless synthetic life form, Lieutenant Commander Data, played by Brent Spiner. Known to an entire generation as the host of Reading Rainbow, LeVar Burton was cast as the ship's helmsman Geordi LaForge, Gates McFadden as Dr. Beverly Crusher, and Will Wheaton as her son Wesley. Michael Dorn was the controversial Klingon officer Worf. Denise Crosby was initially cast as Counselor Troy, but that role ultimately went to Marina Sirtis, with Crosby switching to security officer Tasha Yar. That's good. That's good. It's one take. One take. A lot of thought was given to the series theme song. Should they go with the original series theme to maintain a sense of continuity, some familiarity for the fans? That came with some very complicated rights issues that they would have to cut through. Or should they compose a new theme altogether as a clean jumping on point for new fans who may not have any experience with the franchise, which would be very expensive? Ultimately, they decided to use the theme written by Jerry Goldsmith for the first movie, avoiding the rights issues with the original theme and creating a sense of familiarity with the audience and saving some money. Production on Star Trek: The Next Generation was wrought with conflict right out of the gate. Roddenberry saw Paramount as the enemy, and any demands they made of him were met with vitriol. The ownership Roddenberry exerted over development was directed internally toward the writers as well. While the writers were freed from the standards and practices of regular television production, they found the limitations of Roddenberry's guidelines to be restrictive. Not to mention his habit of rewriting their scripts and, in some cases, claiming half the credit without their approval. When Paramount asked for a 2-hour pilot episode, Roddenberry refused, preferring a 1-hour episode. After relenting, he added an entire subplot to the episode, introducing the character Q to DC Fontana's existing script. The Writers Guild would ultimately reward him with half credit and half residuals. The first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation aired on September 28, 1987 in syndication. It was a perfect formula for Paramount. Stations that wanted Star Trek had to commit to not only purchasing reruns of The Next Generation in the future, but had to run all the new Next Generation episodes if they wanted to run the original series as well. Nearly all of the 150 stations that were at the time running the original series agreed to pick up the new series. By the time it aired, The Next Generation could be viewed in 90% of markets throughout the US. The pilot episode, Encounter at Farpoint, posted ratings higher than the shows it preempted and higher than shows running on the major networks. Success that masked the disarray that was still developing behind the scenes. The more Roddenberry dug in on his vision of a future where interpersonal conflict no longer existed, the more they ran for the door. How do you write a drama when the characters can't get mad at each other? When they don't argue? Literally, where is the drama?
Where's the dish?
Roddenberry felt such a great degree of ownership over Star Trek that he employed a lawyer who would intervene when he thought Paramount wasn't adhering closely enough to his established vision. Writers, producers, and actors began to feel a sense of alienation when they had no ability to exert their own talents, and no expectation that their contributions would go unaltered by Roddenberry. Over 30 writers came and went during the first season, demonstrating the degree to which few wanted to stay in such a restrictive creative environment. Things settled down a bit when Roddenberry was replaced as everyday showrunner by Maurice Hurley at the end of season 1, partially due to the conflicts with the rest of the team, but also due to Roddenberry's failing health. Season 2 introduced a new regular character in Guinan, played by Whoopi Goldberg, and a terrible new danger to the Federation, the Borg, a practically indestructible hive-mind species of cybernetic organisms that expand their numbers by assimilating organic life forms. Season 2 was also shortened by 4 episodes due to a writer's strike in 1988. For 153 days, writers were prohibited from producing scripts or even communicating with the production crew. Cast members were afraid that Next Generation, the young series, would be one of the first canceled as a result. New showrunner Maurice Hurley conducted his position as though he were personally responsible for carrying on the legacy of Roddenberry's mission. As time went by, that burden weighed heavily on Hurley, who came into his own conflicts with writers and actors as a result. Throughout season 1, Hurley, only a writer at the time, didn't like the character of Dr. Beverly Crusher, nor Gates McFadden, who played her. McFadden, of her own admission, came from a more open, creative environment in her previous roles, the New York theater scene where she felt like she could freely express her ideas and have more back and forth over character development. Management saw her as a demanding, difficult actor, and combined with Hurley's dissatisfaction with Dr. Crusher, made it an easy call for Hurley to fire her when he took over. In season 2, she was replaced by Diana Muldaur as Dr. Pulaski, a change that was undone when Hurley was replaced as showrunner at the end of season 2 by Michael Piller. Gates McFadden was asked to come back by producer Rick Berman, an invitation she accepted after seeing the fan demand for her return through phone calls and letters to the studio, and ultimately a personal request from Patrick Stewart. Captain's orders. That's how they do it, right, in Star Trek? Things took off in the 3rd season as new showrunner Michael Piller was able to lead with a steady but flexible hand. Alongside Rick Berman as executive producer, the two took over completely from Roddenberry and held those roles until the end of the series. The Starfleet crew's skin-tight, skeleton-crushing unitards were replaced with the iconic 2-piece uniforms featuring a high collar, shoulder pads, and more of the actor's anatomy left to the imagination. And, for the first time of many, the season ended on a cliffhanger as Captain Jean-Luc Picard was captured by the Borg and his fate left in question when Commander Riker orders the Enterprise to fire on the Borg ship. The cliffhanger was a legitimate risk by showrunner Michael Piller. It was something that had never been done on Star Trek before, and they genuinely did not know how it would be resolved until the 1st episode of the 4th season. Too many contracts were in limbo, and they didn't know who was going to be back the following year. That particular conflict with the Borg was resolved in the season 4 premiere episode, but the impact of that two-parter is still being felt in Star Trek stories today. It was a break from the rigidity of the Roddenberry style of Star Trek conflict and marked the spectacular arrival of what fans could expect from this next generation of Star Trek. 1991 was Star Trek's 25th anniversary as a franchise. It was the year that Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, the final film featuring the entire original series crew, was released, and the 5th season of The Next Generation started on television. It was also the year that Gene Roddenberry passed away at age 70. 6 feature films, 2 live-action and 1 animated series, an incredible legacy for an inspired concept that had been successful financially and impactful socially. 1993 saw the end of the 6th season of The Next Generation and the beginning of The Next Generation as the newest Star Trek series, Deep Space Nine, made its debut, preparing for the television audience handoff when Next Generation concluded. 1994 marked the 7th and final season of The Next Generation despite the expectation and contractual obligations for 8 seasons. Paramount was ready to move the Next Generation cast to movie theaters to fill the gap left by the absence of the original series crew, and to actually save money by paying actors to be in movies instead of new television episodes. Star Trek: The Next Generation averaged 20 million viewers, a feat that put it on the same level as popular network shows like Wheel of Fortune, Cheers, and LA Law. It was a top 10 drama that won 18 Emmy Awards, and as of the 7th season, was the only syndicated television series to be nominated for an Emmy for Best Dramatic Series. Star Trek is and always has been a very popular franchise. It has always been supported by a lot of licensed merchandise. We cannot possibly cover everything that was produced with Jean-Luc Picard's face on it. A ton of novels and a ton of comic books, coffee mugs, posters, die-cast collectibles, communicator badges, ornaments, banks, marbles, stickers, postcards, puzzles, Hamilton collection decorative plates. If there is a market where an item could be licensed and produced, it was covered by a product. And that obviously includes toys. First, a line of action figures and role-play items by Galoob in 1988 and 1989, then much more exhaustively by Playmates beginning in 1992. A full comprehensive collection of figures, playsets, role-play items, and electronic ships. Nearly every character you could want in every outfit you could want them in. As with toys, there were a bunch of games. Trivia games, classic board games, interactive VCR games, electronic handheld games, customizable card games, next-generation themed chess. And a bunch of video games, from the Nintendo Entertainment System to the PC and Mac, Game Boy to Game Gear, Super NES, PlayStation, and Sega Genesis. Episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation have been released on every available home video technology that has existed since it first aired. The entire series was released on VHS in 1991 and Laserdisc beginning in 1991 through 1999. For the 20th anniversary of the series in 2007, the series was released on DVD. For the 25th anniversary, 5 years later, CBS released a remastered 1080p version taken from the original 35mm negatives, newly recomposed visual effects, and CGI, and released it again on Blu-ray as individual seasons or a 41-disc box set called The Full Journey. As of this video, you can stream the entire series on various streaming services like Hulu, Amazon Prime Video, Netflix, Apple iTunes, and Paramount+. After the 7th season of the television series, feature films became the focus for the crew of the Enterprise. 1994's Generations was followed by First Contact in 1996, Insurrection in 1998, and finally Nemesis in 2002. Paramount would finally get their dedicated network, Paramount Plus, in March of 2021, born out of CBS All Access, which started in October of 2014. Jean-Luc Picard is the focus of the exclusive series Star Trek Picard that takes place 20 years after the events of the film Nemesis. The final episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation was viewed by over 30 million people. Its popularity established Star Trek as a television property that was more viable and more popular than it had ever been, including at the peak of the original series. Viewers were so engaged with Star Trek that Paramount was able to launch a 4th series, Deep Space Nine, to carry on the television legacy in 1993, and then a 5th series, Voyager, just 2 years later in 1995. The concepts, themes, and characters are still influencing the Star Trek universe today, despite a 7-year period where the franchise existed in an alternate timeline prior to the events of the original series. The Next Generation's impact on pop culture is vast and enduring, from its ship design and concepts of intergalactic space travel to the way we pronounce data. Steven Spielberg tried in 1985 with Goonies, but it didn't stick until Next Generation repeated it over and over every day of the week for nearly a decade. Star Trek: The Next Generation proved that the themes of Star Trek could transcend the 1960s, that the Enterprise could evolve and grow and still be the same ship fans fell in love with during the original series, that there were other stories about other characters to be told because Star Trek wasn't just about the first crew of the Enterprise. It was about the generation that started it and the generations that have yet to discover it. Thanks for watching. Please hit like, hit subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. Thank you very much to those of you who already are. If you're in the position to help the channel grow, if you would like early access to the videos ad-free, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/toygalaxy. Let us know in the comments down below when you opened your heart to Star Trek. I was a diehard Star Wars guy until I started watching Next Generation, and really that's all it took. Great writing, great performances, great characters, and more importantly, like hundreds of episodes where Star Wars at the time had 3 movies and a bunch of comic books. I love Star Wars, but even I had to admit that Star Trek won on volume and depth and character development and a more fulfilling entertainment experience over a greater amount of time. Just that. Just a few things. It's different today, though. Now we have Baby Yoda. Who's winning now?